Our lecture for this week will cover the libertarian principle, which simply states that each person should be free to live however she decides, so long as she does not use her freedom to restrict the freedom of another person. Libertarianism promotes our fundamental right as the right to liberty, and this means that each of us should never use any individual as a tool for the betterment of society, no matter how just the cause. So in your textbook, Michael Sando writes that if this libertarian theory of rights is correct, then many of the activities of the modern state are illegitimate, and they're violations of liberty. Only a minimal state, one that enforces contracts, protects private property from theft, and keeps the peace, is compatible with the libertarian theory of rights. And so from this libertarian principle, we can understand why many libertarians reject three types of policies and laws that modern states commonly enact. For example, a libertarian would typically argue for no paternalism. These would be laws protecting people from themselves. A libertarian argues that such laws are restrictions on freedom. A libertarian will also typically argue against the idea of moral legislation, and so there should be freedom from the moral convictions of the majority. And then third, no redistribution of income or wealth. And so a libertarian, if you take the ideas to their logical conclusion, would want very minimal taxes, and some libertarians even argue for no taxes whatsoever. Now, sometimes people will look at the idea of no taxes and they'll worry that this would create greater wealth inequality. These people might ask, is it unjust that 1% of Americans possess over a third of the country's wealth? Well, a libertarian will typically respond by considering two aspects of justice. First, justice in acquisition. In other words, did they earn their money fairly? Was there any theft involved? If there was no theft, and if they did earn their money fairly, then they would ask a second question about justice, and that is, was there justice in transfer? In other words, was there free consent? Was it a free market? If the answer is yes to that question, then there is nothing unjust with 1% of Americans possessing over a third of the country's wealth, provided that they got that wealth fairly. So let's briefly look at each of these types of policies more closely. No paternalism. A libertarian will typically argue that government should not create laws against people harming themselves. This could include things like seatbelt laws, laws against drug and substance abuse. A libertarian would typically be in favor of legalizing marijuana, and they would argue against laws like soda laws. So, for example, Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, enacted a law on sugary drinks larger than 16 ounces. And Bloomberg argued that these should not be available for sale, whether in a movie theater or in gas stations, because he said that New York City has spent $4 billion a year on health care for overweight residents, and sugary drinks are the most significant factor in the increase of the number of obese and overweight New York citizens. Now, a libertarian would look at a law like this and say, these types of laws restrict individual liberty, and therefore we should have no paternalism. Now, this connects to a second type of policy that a libertarian will typically reject, and that would be laws promoting moral legislation. And so this highlights an important distinction between libertarianism and utilitarianism. So utilitarian will argue that we ought to do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the most amount of people, which seems like a principle that would protect the majority opinion of a given culture. Libertarians, on the other hand, have a principled objection against favoring the majority opinion of any culture, because by doing so, you're restricting the rights of an individual. Now, this concept leads to the idea of no redistribution of wealth or income, because this is perhaps the clearest example of the majority trying to coerce a minority group, specifically a minority group that is wealthy. And so a libertarian argues that taxes is simply a way of restricting the rights of a minority group. So to consider why this is so, let's consider Robert Nozick's argument against taxation, where he compares taxation to a form of slavery. Now, in his argument, he lays out 9 different stages of slavery, moving from slavery that is completely inhumane to slavery that is increasingly humane. So let's work through these 9 stages together. Stage 1 is where you are a slave with a brutal master. This is perhaps the clearest example of slavery because you are being mistreated by somebody who is over you and you have no rights to argue back. You just have to do whatever your master tells you to do. Now, stage 2, you're still a slave, but you're a slave with a better master. Maybe somebody who considers your thoughts and wants you to have a say in what type of work you'll do. Stage 3, you are now part of a group of slaves, so now you have people who can relate with you in your slavery. Stage 4, you are still a slave, but one who only has to work for 5 days. So now you'll get 2 days off to do whatever you want, but for 5 days, you are still obligated to work for your master. Stage 5, now you can work wherever you want to work, but you need to pay taxes to your master. So in this case, it's more humane certainly than stages 4, 3, 2, and 1, because you can go wherever you want, so long as you send the fruit of your labor back to your master. Stage 6, every other slave can vote, but not you. Stage 7, you are allowed to persuade others who can vote to vote in your favor, but you're still not given an opportunity to vote for yourself. Stage 8, you can vote, but only if there is a tie. And then stage 9, you are able to vote for whatever policy you want, but you still have to pay taxes. So now, as we work through these 9 stages, Nozick asks, at what stage did slavery stop? And his answer is that slavery never stopped, because even at stage 9, which is more humane than the other stages of slavery, you are still paying taxes. And so really this is the heart of Nozick's argument. If you are paying taxes, then you are enslaved. Taxation, he argues, is the taking of earnings. And so if you have earnings that are being taken from you, then he argues this is really sort of a forced labor, because it's saying that you do not have the right to keep all the fruit of your labor. So even in a situation where you're able to vote, your vote only goes so far. And so if you cast one vote and all of society casts a vote against you, you are forced to go along with what society wants from you. And what this means from Nozick's perspective is that at the end of the day, you do not own yourself. You are owned either by society at large or by a particular government. Whoever is taking your earnings owns a portion of your labor. And so if you're forced to labor, you are a slave. Maybe it's a humane form of slavery, but it's still a form of slavery because, Nozick argues, taxation violates the principle of self-ownership, and it maintains that the society owns me, or at least part of me. And so the libertarian principle is this fundamental right to have a right to liberty. And it argues that we should never use any individual as a tool for the betterment of society, no matter how just the cause. And taxation would be just using some people as a tool for the betterment of society. So now this libertarian principle brings up some important social implications that we need to consider carefully when it comes to understanding the role of ethics in politics. So if we were to ask, what services should the government provide? We should realize that we cannot answer this question without digging into some fundamental principles of liberty, equality, or happiness for the majority. So should the government provide public education? And here I'm thinking K through 12 education. Should it provide for universal free healthcare? Should it provide for housing or for roads? Or should the government fund college education, either undergraduate education or master's level education or PhD level education? Should the government provide retirement for all of its citizens? Should it provide funding for transportation, for student debt relief, for the military, for welfare? On your discussion board for this week, I want you to discuss your thoughts on these questions, and specifically on the relationship between government and liberty. So if the government does provide such services, then where should we get the money? Should everyone be required to pay for these services? Should the people who use the services and them only pay for it? Or should we force the wealthy to foot the bill? I want you to also discuss number 3, the question of will such government services lead to greater restrictions on liberty? And so now here I'm thinking about laws like the ones banning soda. So one of the reasons that Bloomberg cited for pushing the soda ban was because it was costing taxpayers $4 billion a year in healthcare. So an argument could be made that if the government is paying for your healthcare, if they're footing the bill, then they should also be able to tell you what you can eat or drink. But that seems like a restriction on liberty, and I want you to discuss that question on your discussion board as well. And then last, I want you to talk about the ethics of voting. Ethicist Stanley Hauerwas once stated that voting is where 51% of the population gets to control 49% of the population. In other words, by voting, you are potentially, or maybe even likely, restricting the rights of someone who has a different set of moral values than you. Do you agree with this idea? Why or why not? So take time to discuss each of these questions now in your discussion groups.